Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur, on a very pivotal week, if not day. Haviv, thank you so much for joining me. Where are we finding you today?
Thank you, Amanda. I'm in Boston, visiting the wonderful Jewish community of Boston.
Beautiful. Now, Haviv, 15 months after the war in Gaza began with Hamas's devastating attack on southern Israel, Jerusalem and the Palestinian terror group might have reached an agreement yesterday on a ceasefire and hostage release deal. It's expected to take effect on Sunday, January 19th, with the first of the hostages set to be released that day. We don't actually know at recording time if there is indeed a deal, but to all appearances, there could be, and it appears as well as if Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is backing down from many of the statements he has said throughout these 15 months of war, including, of course, Haviv, we talked about many times, the need for Israel to be in the Philadelphia corridor, so many other points that were just immovable until now are all of a sudden flexible points. I know the region has changed, the world has changed, so much has changed, but is it possible that it has a lot to do with January 20th, in your opinion?
Yeah, the deal itself has not been confirmed, as you said, and it's not 100% clear what the sticking points are. It looks like on the Hamas side, there's some question of the identities of some of the prisoners Israel will be required to release. It looks like on the Israeli side, the sticking point is essentially Netanyahu in intense negotiations over the last couple of days with Bezalel Smotrich, possibly indirectly also with Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far right of his coalition, to try and hold on to them because they're threatening to leave over this deal that they believe will leave Hamas in power. And so Netanyahu has a real political problem. Hamas has some specific details. Again, we're getting leaks. It's hard to know how reliable all the leaks are. But then, just literally this morning, Israel time, a senior official, an unnamed senior official, that's usually Netanyahu himself, released to the press a statement that said that in contrast to distorted reports about Israel potentially leaving the Philadelphia corridor, Israel will remain on that route throughout Phase 1 for all 42 days of Phase 1. And the scale of forces will remain the same, including outposts, patrols, observation sites, control of the entirety of the corridor. This is really fundamental because Israeli control of Philadelphia means that for the duration of at least Phase 1, those 42 days, Israel can continue to prevent Hamas from rearming, from smuggling through those tunnels across the Egyptian border. And Netanyahu has essentially been insisting the audience for this leak is not regular Israelis. The audience for this leak is not the Americans or Hamas. The audience for this leak is the roughly 23% of the Israeli electorate that polls tell us. The last poll was the Israel Democracy Institute poll on Tuesday. That's its number. 23% totally reject the deal and believe that the deal will lead to Hamas surging back into Gaza, retaking Gaza, and the war being lost for Israel. Netanyahu has a problem. Those 23% are almost entirely his voters, or voters for his coalition. And those 23% are starting to wonder whether he can be trusted to actually win the war. The reason a great many Israelis on the center and left want a deal and is that they have essentially lost faith that, not that the war is winnable, some of course say that, but that Netanyahu is going to push for that win and push for that victory. He's capable, or he wants to do that. And so distrust of Netanyahu is a real liability in this war effort. And with this deal, there's a real threat. Netanyahu is taking a tremendous political risk, and he knows it. Everything I'm saying, Netanyahu, it's front of mind for Netanyahu. He's taking a tremendous political risk of starting to actually lose or convince a quarter of the Israeli electorate that's entirely his base and far-right voters for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, that he's not trustworthy as well. So he claims that he's staying in Philadelphia. There are these last-minute hiccups on both sides, but the fundamental question, the question that's really interesting and that we need to really, I think, delve into and understand better, is Netanyahu's political gamble that he's taking here.
I hear what you're saying, Haviv, but that same poll, if I'm not mistaken, in the same poll, 51.5% of Likud voters, that's of course Netanyahu's party, did support a partial or complete deal. And in that same poll, something like 48% of religious Zionist voters did support a full or complete deal, some kind of deal at least. And so, yeah, there is this, what did you say, 23% that doesn't want the war to end. And we're seeing them today outside the Knesset, and they were there last night as well. We're talking about the Tikva Forum. We're talking about the Gvura group. These are traditionally right-wing voters who, would support the Netanyahu coalition, but they're not necessarily the Netanyahu core base.
Right, but Netanyahu has no government without them. And the leadership of those parties, there's generally a sort of cultural dynamic on the right, in the right-wing parties, in which the more right-wing, the more strident tend to win the debate. It's very hard to pull a party that defines itself in opposition to a kind of centrist mainstream, that is its identity. It's very hard to then pull it into its more centrist part of its own voter base. Basically, I mean, the numbers you said, are exactly right. There's half of Likud and almost half of religious Zionism who don't necessarily support the full deal, all the phases of the deal, which would, of course, leave Hamas in power in Gaza, but at least the first phase, getting out for 42 days of ceasefire with Israel still in control of Philadelphia, getting out 33 hostages. We have good numbers of the general public, 58%, including a majority of both Jews and Arabs, support the deal in full, support ending the war in exchange for all the hostages. And another 12%, that's, by the way, not a comment that the deal is good. It's not a comment that the deal will succeed, that it's possible to get there, that Hamas won't drag it out for its own survival. It's not a policy point. The point is, asked whether you support the deal in full, in all its stipulations, 58% of Israelis said yes. And another 12% support the first phase, but not any further phases. And that 12% is probably those, what you mentioned about the roughly 40% of religious Zionism. And so 70% want Netanyahu to sign on the dotted line. That's the bottom line. And 23%, without whom he falls, don't absolutely oppose him signing anything having to do with this deal. And so he's walked into a political crisis, a genuine political crisis. He has to bring Smotrich on board. Ben Gvir has already declared multiple times he's leaving the coalition. It's going to be hard to see how he climbs down off that tree without hurting his own political position with his support, with his base. And that's fascinating. Something happened over the last week or two that for the first time in 16 months made Netanyahu willing to face down, knowing exactly what was going to happen, knowing what it meant, knowing these numbers better than anybody, face down his far right flank in order to push forward the deal.
I moved from Canada to the United States when I was 10, and we moved there on January 18th. I started school in the United States on January 19th, and the first thing I learned is that January 20th is inauguration day. And so I put to you, Haviv, that January 20th, inauguration day, is perhaps the key to Netanyahu's change of heart, or at least courage right now to stand up for perhaps what he thinks is right, or at least what the Israeli people thinks is right.
I think so. And everybody thinks so. Right-wing pundits who are very frustrated with Netanyahu for agreeing to this deal are suggesting that he's caved to pressure from the Trump administration, which for them is this shocking, horrific, revelation. And some of their opponents from the center left have no small amount of schadenfreude. You have Netanyahu booster, this media personality, Non Magal, who has repeatedly tweeted, total victory, no less, which is quoting Netanyahu's repeated vow of total victory. And he has now suddenly either gone silent or tried to pretend like it's not happening, or maybe Trump is giving something dramatic in return, which is not something Non Magal actually said. He's just sticking to the embarrassed silence kind of strategy. Netanyahu's biggest supporters have noticed this new willingness to strike this deal. Now, 2 points in Netanyahu's defense. Point one, in Netanyahu's defense in right-wing terms to those right-wing critics. Point one, despite President Biden claiming that this is the deal he presented in May, it is not actually the deal he presented in May. There are specific and dramatic Israeli demands that are present in this deal that Hamas never agreed to in May. For example, remaining in the Philadelphia corridor throughout phase one at significant numbers. For example, the rate of the hostage release. These are things that are different, and they are not small things. There is one other enormous difference between the deal Biden presented in May and this deal, which is that Hamas agreed. Hamas didn't agree in the past, which is kind of a small detail that people tend to overlook as we discuss whether, Netanyahu's own interests, etc., and impulses and motivations. Long story short, I want to suggest that what actually happened is not the right-wing criticism of Netanyahu. It's not the left-wing criticism of Netanyahu, which is that Netanyahu is now just under so much pressure from Trump, just literally being squeezed by Trump. And Netanyahu, the center-left argues, is a man who always caves and always takes the path of least resistance. So he didn't go into Rafah for 4 months because Biden squeezed him, and then he went into Rafah because Smotrich squeezed him. And over the last week, we've seen Itamar Ben-Gvir, when he was explaining why he's leaving the coalition, repeatedly that his political influence over Netanyahu is the reason he didn't agree to a deal in the past. And he said it in this cocky, sort of showy kind of way. I'm so powerful that, which is just absolutely horrifying, because it's one thing to say, I disagree profoundly with this path. I think it's more dangerous for Israel, but it's a painful decision because we're leaving people to die in Gaza. Nevertheless, it is the right decision, and that is what leadership is. And that's not what Ben-Gvir said. Ben-Gvir just showed off that he had so much power of Netanyahu that he prevented a deal and sort of mocked the tremendous suffering of Israeli hostages. But what Ben-Gvir also did by saying my political influence prevented a deal in the past was confirm the left's argument that Netanyahu only left Israelis to rot in Hamas dungeons in Gaza for his own politics.
I don't think it confirms it necessarily, because this is, of course, Ben-Gvir that we're talking about, who is, known for his posturing and hyperbole, shall we say?
Exactly. And for being willing to torment hostage families for his little political gimmicks. Exactly right. I disagree with Ben-Gvir, and I disagree with the criticism of Netanyahu on this point. We saw, and we don't quite know, right? There are two deals right now on the table. There's Netanyahu-Hamas, that deal, and then there's Netanyahu-Trump. And we saw a putting together of a Netanyahu-Trump deal. We just have no idea what's in it. We know in great detail what's in the Netanyahu-Hamas deal and almost nothing about what's in the Netanyahu-Trump deal. But it is a fact, right? The Netanyahu's change of heart came in tandem with intensive conversations with Trump officials, by the way, including with Donald Trump himself, who Netanyahu spoke to on these questions, and with Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, so much so that Arab officials have publicly suggested that one meeting between Witkoff and Netanyahu back on Saturday, and the Times of Israel's covered this, did more to bring Netanyahu around than a year of Biden administration cajoling and pressure. I don't think we need to take them at their word. This is also propaganda and positioning. Again, Hamas never actually agreed to any previous version of the deal before we right now blame Netanyahu for being some kind of chief obstacle to a deal. But I do think that meeting was significant, and I do think that we saw a Trump-Netanyahu deal being put together. And now the question is, what did Netanyahu buy? And what did he buy that's so valuable to him? I do share the center-left critique that he is overpoweringly concerned with his own politics and political position and political survival, probably unhealthily so. So what's worth even risking that? And I want to suggest that we have two signals from the incoming Trump administration. One was Pete Hegseth in his confirmation hearings to be Secretary of Defense, very bluntly told the senators, I believe he was responding to a question from Senator Tom Cotton, I support Israel destroying and killing every last member of Hamas. That's the quote. And another one was incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz in his first interview ahead of taking the job with the Call Me Back podcast, in which he said that Trump was committed to fundamentally changing the dynamic in which terrorist groups take hostages from America or from democracies. He named Brittany Griner, an American Olympian that Russia took as hostage, and that required America to release this notorious arms dealer in order to get her out. But he specifically focused in also on Hamas. And he said terrorist groups and rogue states have been taking American hostages and only seen upsides for doing so over the last 4 years. So why not take more? Why not take as many as you can and see what you get? With President Trump, he made it very clear very early, not just with Hamas, with groups around the world, there'll be nothing but downsides. And then Walt said, Hamas has to be destroyed to the point that it cannot reconstitute. Netanyahu has been promising Smotrich that this deal ends after phase 1 and we go back to crushing Hamas. And Trump's people, the next Secretary of Defense and the next National Security Advisor, seem to be saying exactly the same thing and exactly on the same page, and there'll be massive Trump backing for a more significant operation against Hamas. That's 1. 2, Iran.
And it's not the same world that it was when Biden announced the ceasefire deal that had been reached that, of course, you mentioned Hamas did not agree to, but then, of course, there are all sorts of sticking points on the Israeli side as well. Iran is a very different regime now. Don't you think that is a huge calculation? Hezbollah is a hugely different regime now. Not a regime, a hugely different terrorist force that is much less forceful.
I think that we have discovered over the last 3-4 months, we've discovered because they forced us to discover. They forced us to remember that we are powerful and we believe that we have no other choice. And the path that Iran had chosen for us ends in catastrophe. And so we stood up and we began to challenge Iran directly. And Iran collapsed like a house of cards. And it's astonishing to watch. 120 Israeli planes flying over Iraq, entering into Iranian airspace, taking out anything they felt like taking out. Iran's oil infrastructure was not saved by Iranian exertions or capabilities, but by the Biden administration pressuring Israel not to bomb it. Iran's oil infrastructure is 50% owned by the IRGC. It is the main source of foreign income to Iran's proxy wars. So it's all utterly fragile and vulnerable to Israeli attack. And Israel, with no cost, has been able to prove that it can do anything it wants in Iran, dismantle anything it wants. The actual nuclear program is buried deep underground. It's not clear. I say this just out of ignorance. I'm not one of the people who knows, and maybe only people with high security clearance know that we have the kind of bunker busters that could actually penetrate the nuclear program. But the entirety of the oil infrastructure and the natural gas infrastructure and all the things that are keeping that half-teetering economy alive are absolutely above ground and totally exposed to us. And so the Iranian regime is weak, it is fragile, and Israel's power and strength has only risen. What we need from the Trump administration on the Iran question isn't troops on the ground. It isn't regional war. It isn't to bomb Iran. It'd be nice to get those 12-ton bunker busters. I think that would be handy. But, we can do so much damage. All we need is for them not to stand in the way that the Biden administration stood in the way. And we already discussed how Biden administration sanctions, even small sanctions, on tankers carrying some, oil to China had a tremendous effect on the financial health of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Well, that tells us a great deal about Trump's potential for game-changing decisions in the Middle East at unbelievably low cost for America. So what did Netanyahu and Witkoff talk about? What has Netanyahu been negotiating out of the Trump administration? It was something big enough to make him willing to take vast political risks. I suspect, I believe, I assume that he actually wants to get the hostages out and feels sympathy and empathy for them. I know that for about half of Israelis, that's a controversial statement. For the other half of Israelis, they assume Netanyahu deeply cares about the hostages, but also a quarter of the Israelis don't, even though they care about the hostages, don't want the war to end because They have to lower the value of hostages for there not to be future hostages. This is a painful and serious and big debate. I don't want to get into it. I'm not interested in it. Netanyahu does not take dramatic political risks, except if the benefit is potentially very dramatic. So it looks, from the outside, putting all these pieces together, like Netanyahu has gone all in on Trump and taken this enormous gamble in which he is risking his own political position, and he's risking it because there is a boon on the other side of it. And it is a boon we're getting signals from the incoming administration, from the most important people, the people who are going to run the American military, run American national security. And that's what I think is happening. There's not one deal on the table, there's two, and we should be trying to figure out what exactly is in the second deal.
I would agree with you 100%, but I've always thought throughout these 15 months that what is the problem for Netanyahu to make a deal with Hamas? Because we all know that Hamas is going to abrogate the deal. They can't help themselves. They always do it. Every single time that Israel makes any kind of ceasefire deal with Hamas, they abrogate it. It's just a matter of time. And that time could even work in Israel's favor. We can set ourselves up more. We can get more soldiers. We can train better. We can, lick our wounds a little bit, because we do have tens of thousands of wounded people physically, emotionally, and then become stronger and take them down entirely. If at this point we're saying already that we can't remove Hamas entirely and get the hostages out, why not get the hostages out, regroup? We know Hamas is going to do something foolish, some provocation, and then go in and finish off the job.
I think there's another element. I agree, but there's also another element, which is the astonishing disparity in competence between the Israeli effort against Hamas and the Israeli effort against Hezbollah. We were utterly penetrated, had utterly penetrated Hezbollah to the point that it was, sometimes you don't want to win too dramatically and easily, because it's just embarrassing and you start to feel bad for the other side. I'm being facetious, folks. But that's the scale of the Israeli victory against Hezbollah. It was absolutely astonishing. No one imagined Israel having those kinds of capabilities. Why did it have those kinds of capabilities? Because it had done nothing for 15 years but focus its absolute concerted efforts on Hezbollah and the entirety of the intelligence apparatus of all the different intelligence agencies, including that little branch of the intelligence services that's supposed to ask itself if everyone else is getting it wrong. All of them were absolutely unanimous in agreeing that Hamas is not a threat. And so there weren't the capabilities in Hamas that there were in Hezbollah, and nobody had taken the time to build them. Well, let them come out. Let them come out of the tents. We have seen in the last day Hamas people coming out of the tent encampments of the civilians that are, shielding from the Israeli airstrikes. Turns out there are thousands of Hamas fighters embedded among those civilians wearing civilian clothes. Suddenly, they pulled out of their bags their uniforms and came out and declared how tremendously militaristic and brave they are. Good. Track them. A lot of Gazans hate Hamas now. A lot of Gazans have a lot of reason to hate Hamas. You don't have to love Israel. The Lebanese who turned on Hezbollah and gave Israel the intelligence it needed didn't love Israel. They hated Hezbollah. So we have an opportunity now to direct the kind of focus that drove the Hezbollah victory onto Hamas. And I know for a fact that is something that the Israelis are doing. It's going to be a different war when the war renews than it was until now. That's the point.
Right, because I think everyone understands it is inevitable. Even those, perhaps not Biden, but even those who are saying the end of the war. It's not the end of the war. It's the end of this battle. You have to think more in terms of a long game. This is not something that's going to be solved over a piece of paper tonight, tomorrow. It's not happening like that. This is a very long, long war. Just the first of many battles that will continue. Not even the first. It's another of many battles that we will continue to wage against Hamas.
The great tragedy of Hamas isn't Israeli. It's Gazan. As long as Hamas remains, as long as we don't destroy Hamas, Gaza can't be rebuilt. And anything that is rebuilt will be redestroyed when Hamas inevitably drives toward another round. And Hamas is nothing else. And it has a sunk cost problem. It has already invested so much destruction, so much pain, that it can't now wake up and say, oh, there was a bad strategy, we got to pick a new one. Hamas is the destruction of Gaza and the continuing destruction of Gaza. And by the way, not only do I agree with you, even if you think the Israelis are evil, it doesn't change the simple point that Hamas will not allow the reconstruction of Gaza. You can't dump any amount of money in Gaza and have it actually build Gaza a big and good and prosperous future as long as Hamas is in charge of Gaza. So what we have done here in Hamas's terms is they're going to march and pretend and sing and dance about how it's a great victory for them, because mere survival as they embed themselves in civilian populations who suffer terribly for it is their great victory. But if you're an Israeli and you're looking at Hamas and you're looking at Gaza's state and you're looking at them celebrating and crowing their victory, that's not a victory. What we've just done is one of the crueler things we've ever done to Gaza, which is condemn them to another round. And honestly, it's not a talking point. I genuinely feel really awful for Gaza that it's going to go through another round because Hamas is there. I completely agree. And Israel's victory is so utter and profound and fundamental and structural that the very fact that there is no one in the pro-Palestinian camp, almost no one, who even acknowledges that, who has this serious conversation, is the tragedy, is the disaster, the future disaster, not the last disaster for Gaza, already being built out.
Correct. Haviv, thank you so much for joining me today. So much more to discuss as we hear more details. Such a changing story. We're learning more every single minute, and I wish you safe travels home.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.